everyone. My name is Courtney Doggart. I'm the president of Network 2020. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about the South China Sea with three excellent experts actually, one of whom is playing the moderator role. And we're also very happy to be co-hosting this with the New York Southeast Asia Network, which you'll hear a little bit more about later. So I'm just going to kick it off by introducing our speakers and moderator, and then I'll turn it over to them. And just as a reminder, if at any point you have any questions, please feel free to just enter the questions right in the Q&A box. So first off, we have Gregory Poling, and he's a senior fellow for Southeast Asia and the director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He oversees research on U.S. foreign policy in the Asia Pacific, with a particular focus on the maritime domain in the countries of Southeast Asia. His research interests include the South China Sea disputes, democratization in Southeast Asia, and Asian multilateralism. His writings have been featured in Foreign Affairs, The Wall Street Journal, Nikkei Asian Review, and Foreign Policy, among others. He is the author or co-author of multiple works, including The Thickening Web of Asian Security Cooperation, Deepening Defense Ties Among U.S. Allies and Partners in the Indo-Pacific, Building a More Robust U.S. Philippines Alliance, and A New Era in U.S.-Vietnam Relations, Deepening Ties 2 Decades After Normalization. He received an MA in International Affairs from American University and a BA in History and Philosophy from St. Mary's College of Maryland. Christopher Ankersen is Clinical Associate Professor at the Center for Global Affairs at NYU, where he leads the Global Risk Specialization. And prior to joining NYU, he was the Security Advisor for the UN system in Thailand. And previously, he held positions at the UN Assistance to the Khmer Rouge Trials in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, the UN offices in Geneva and Vienna, and with the Department of Safety and Security in New York, where he was desk officer for Iraq. From 2002 to 2004, he was a Rolf Dahrendorf Scholar at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he has taught at LSE, the London Centre for International Relations, King's College London, Carleton University, and the Royal Military College of Canada, and has also lectured at staff colleges in Canada, Australia, and Denmark. He has acted as policy and strategy government consultant to militaries, governments, and private firms in the UK and Canada. And he was previously an officer in the Canadian Forces. He is a senior research fellow at the German Southeast Asian Center of Excellence for Public Policy and Good Governance at Thammasat University in Thailand, and co-founder of the NYU Project on Armed Forces and Society. And last but definitely not least, we have Anne-Marie Murphy, who is the professor at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations, Seton Hall University, and senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute of Columbia University, and an ASEAN Research Program Fulbright Scholar. Her research interests include international relations and comparative politics in Southeast Asia, U.S. foreign policy toward Asia, and governance of non-traditional security issues. She is co-author of Non-Traditional Security Issues in Southeast Asia, The Transnational Dimension, and co-editor of Legacies of Engagement in Southeast Asia. Her articles have appeared in journals such as Asian Security, Contemporary Southeast Asia, Orbis, Asia Policy, World Politics Review, and PS, Political Science and Politics. She is a founding partner of the New York Southeast Asia Network and is currently completing a book on the impact of democracy on Indonesian foreign policy with the generous support of the Smith Richardson Foundation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anne-Marie, who will talk a little bit about the New York Southeast Asia Network and then kick off the discussion. So thank you all for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Courtney, for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm delighted that the New York Southeast Asia Network is co-sponsoring this. The New York Southeast Asian Network was created in 2015, and our mission is to promote research on, discussion about, and awareness of Southeast Asia and U.S. Southeast Asian relations by collaborating among academics and policymakers, both within the U.S., particularly the tri-state area, and abroad. We organize and promote many events, both in person and online. We publish a weekly newsletter. We advertise these events on our website, so please go check us out. Thank you. So today's event is obviously on the South China Sea issues and prospects. So what I first want to do is give you a little background. So if I could please have the first map. The South China Sea, as you can see here, is a very strategic body of water that connects the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It's critical to global trade. Approximately $4.3 billion of global trade, make that $1 trillion of global trade passes through annually. And as you can see on this map, there are long-standing disputes over islands. Up here in the northern part of the South China Sea are the Paracel Islands, which are claimed in whole by both Vietnam and China. Down here in the southern part of the South China Sea, these islands are claimed by China in its entirety, as well as Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So these disputes over islands are long-standing, but for decades they were largely a frozen conflict. May I have the second map, please? The conflict really heated up. May I have the second map, please? The conflict really heated up in 2009 when China published its quote-unquote 9-dash line, which you can see here in red. Some folks call it the long tongue. China published this map with the UN, and it claimed the waters and all of the islands within it as Chinese, and claimed that they had indisputable islands. Now, indisputable sovereignty over everything within the map, which accounts for approximately 90% of the South China Sea. Now, to many countries like the United States, this amounted to the privatization of international waters, i.e., a critical component of the global commons. To many Southeast Asian states, China's claims of indisputable sovereignty created new conflicts over maritime territory, which you can see in these shaded areas here, the purple with the Philippines, and over here with Vietnam. Because under the UN law of the sea, or UNCLOS, states have a right to exploit the resources, think oil, gas, fish, within their exclusive economic zones, which extend, very complicated, but typically 200 miles offshore. So as you can see, this 9-dash line map and China's sovereignty claims created these new conflicts. And in the years since, China published this map in 2009. It's asserted its claims much more forcefully. In 2012, China claimed Scarborough Shoal right here, seized it forcefully from the Philippines. China has declared unilateral fishing bans in waters disputed with Vietnam. It has dragged survey ships into waters, again, claimed by Vietnam for drilling purposes. Many of these have led to skirmishes. The Philippines filed a legal claim against China's claims with the UN Law of the Sea Permanent Court of Arbitration, which in 2016 declared China's 9-dash line inconsistent with international law, and it invalidated most of China's claims. However, China has refused to abide by that ruling. Now, arguably the biggest game changer in the South China Sea in recent years is that China has built and militarized artificial islands, which give it the ability to project power deep into Southeast Asia. May I have map 3, please? So this map is an aerial picture, courtesy of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, which illustrates the construction of all of this territory, i.e. poured concrete, over what had been a submerged reef that China seized from the Philippines in 1995. On Mischief Reef, as well as other features, artificial islands that China has constructed. It has also built ports for ships, radar facilities for intelligence gathering and communication. It's constructed airfields and hangars for fighter jets, and it's deployed air-to-surface missiles. In short, China has created these forward operating bases that threaten not only the interests of regional Southeast Asian states, but also those of countries like the United States. These bases give China the ability to implement an anti-area access denial strategy that could restrict freedom of navigation through the waters and over the airspace. Freedom of navigation is the most critical U.S. interest in the South China Sea because it's critical to defend its allies in the region. So the South China Sea has therefore become a critical focal point of Sino-U.S. rivalry at a time when China is challenging the U.S. for leadership within the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. And as Sino-U.S. tension rises over COVID, over trade wars and other issues, both Washington and Beijing are putting pressure on Southeast Asian states to choose sides, something Southeast Asian states are loath to do. So many of you may know that there's an old saying that says, whoever rules the sea rules the world. And since the end of World War II, the US has been the world's predominant military power. But China is clearly challenging the US. And this is recognized by US Admiral Philip Davidson, currently the head of Indo-PACOM, who in his April 2018 Senate confirmation hearings stated that the creation and militarization of islands in the South China Sea gives China control over those waters in all scenarios short of war. So with that as a brief background, I'd now like to turn the conversation over to Christopher Ankersen, who will give us more up-to-date perspectives from the Southeast Asian states, and then we'll turn it over to Gregory Poland for a discussion of the US interests and Sino-US rivalry, etc. Thank you. Christopher?
Thanks, Anne-Marie, and thank you to Courtney and the entire team at Network 2020 and the New York Southeast Asia Network for organizing this and inviting me to participate. I want to take about 10 minutes to highlight two main perspectives on the South China Sea dispute, expressed as metaphors, both food-related, which probably says more about me than it does about the region. The first metaphor is that the South China Sea is like a crooked wedding cake. It's multi-layered and asymmetrical. And the second metaphor is that China is offering up a buffet of salami and carrots, and so far it seems to be working. We'll talk a little bit about ASEAN and its role in the South China Sea, and my main conclusion there is that it's unfortunately contradictory, and this enables a long-term Chinese strategy. A quick overview of the events from 2020 before I move on to those two metaphors. The first event that's worthy of note, I think, is that in March, the Vietnamese government sent a note verbal to the United Nations Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, talking about its dispute with Chinese reckoning of how many of the issues, as expressed by Anne-Marie, were being resolved. Note verbal is not a particularly, it's the usual way in which member states communicate with the United Nations. It certainly was a routine piece of diplomacy, but it's interesting to see that the next month, in April, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel rammed and sunk a Vietnamese fishing vessel near the Paracel Islands. And I think that goes to show an interesting relationship between diplomacy and the use of force that we'll see repeated over and over again in the South China Sea. Also in April, the Chinese government declared the establishment of two administrative structures, basically putting the Paracels, Macclesfield Bank, and the Spratlys under the administrative control over a city in Hainan, one of its southern island, which was a way of essentially normalizing Chinese administrative control over large parts of that area that Anne-Marie showed on the map. Also in April, a Chinese survey ship, a number of survey ships entered the Malaysian economic exclusion zone and began following an oil exploration vessel operated by the Malaysian state oil company Petronas. And again, this idea of Chinese actively disputing other countries' ability to exercise what they claim is their inherent right under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The final event I want to talk about is in May, it was revealed that China apparently has plans to implement an ADIZ. I'm not American, I'm Canadian, so I pronounce it correctly. An air defense identification zone over the Pratas, Paracel, and Spratly Island chains, which, if this is true, and if it were to be implemented, would be similar to what China has done in the East China Sea. Again, an incremental de facto control over large areas of disputed territory that would help to, on one hand, from their perspective, essentially by small incremental achievements, achieve a de facto control over the area. So let me move from that to the two main points that I wanted to make, which is that the first is the South China Sea is a crooked wedding cake. It's multi-layered and it's asymmetrical. Well, what do I mean by that? The stakes start quite low, but they escalate as this dispute goes higher, and we'll talk about that in a second. As it becomes more abstract, we can see that it's really not just about a couple of rocks or atolls in a particularly localized region, but actually has a global significance. So if we start at the bottom layer of the wedding cake, we might see that what we really are talking about here are issues of national sovereignty. Individual claimant states talking about what is theirs or what isn't theirs and what rights they have or don't have within those exclusive zones, which is pretty stock and trade, normal kind of stuff for international relations and diplomacy. If we move up one level of abstraction, we can see that those claims of national sovereignty are eclipsed a little bit really when we're talking about the control over resources. It's not so much that a country cares about what's on the map necessarily, but the fact that what's under that map. By that I mean there is, as Anne-Marie talked about, huge amounts of oil and gas reserves as well as fish in the South China Sea. So it's not so much about who gets what line on the map, but really about who controls those resources. If we move up a level of abstraction further, we can see that perhaps it's really not only about resources, but more about the control of sea lanes of communication. This is the second most trafficked sea lane in the world. It straddles or spans from the Strait of Malacca in the west over to the Strait of Taiwan in the east. And through this area, the strategic seaway, 10 million barrels of oil a day are trafficked. So whoever controls those sea lanes has a lot to gain from that, above and beyond whatever localized resources may or may not be there. If we move up one more level of abstraction, we can see that it's really not only about the sea lanes of communication, but really about the containment of or the breakout of Chinese military forces. For example, it's part of the first island chain, and it would allow whoever controls that to have an impact over submarine basing in Hainan, for example. If Chinese submarines were able to easily move out from that base, or would they instantly run into opposition by American or American allies, as well as the potential for a SSBN or nuclear missile submarine bastion by which they would have a safe haven, as it were, to not only have submarines in bases, but loitering out in the South China Sea. So if you are able to control that waterway, that expanse of ocean, you can actually have an extremely big strategic impact on Chinese military ability to exercise outside of its normal territorial waters. We go even further up the cake, we can see that this is really about U.S. treaty commitments to its allies in the region, namely Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, but even more so about U.S. defense credibility. If it's not able to support its allies, if it's not able to bottle up China and prevent it from establishing sovereign control over this international waterway, then it's really going to lose credibility in the eyes of the world. Which brings us to the top layer of the wedding cake, which is this is really about a conflict between China and the United States about who's going to be the rule maker, who's going to be the rule breaker, and ultimately an example of who might be the next hegemon in international and regional order. So we can see that at any particular time, we tend to see the South China Sea in terms of a snapshot about an event, about a ship that might be sunk, or about an oil field that might be being explored. But there are numerous levels and layers that we need to look at simultaneously. And I think what's interesting is we have seen perhaps too much focus on the idea, for example, that the American military, the American government is focused on so-called freedom of navigation operations as a kind of manifestation of their presence in the region. And they're developing a more comprehensive approach outlined most recently in their strategic approach to the People's Republic of China document that was released in May, seen as a white paper for U.S. Policy vis-a-vis China. So I think sometimes we look too much at events and forget the context that we actually should be putting this into. And as I said, there are several contexts operating at the same time. The second kind of metaphor I want to look at is that China is offering a buffet of salami and carrots, and so far it seems to be working. And what do I mean by that? Well, China tends to approach the South China Sea by incremental events, able to, for example, establish what they originally called shelters for fishermen on some of these islands, and were able to move up, as Anne-Marie showed earlier, to large concrete bases, turning atolls and islands into essentially militarized fortifications. So we have seen this salami tactics, as it's called, of taking one incremental slice at a time, but over time, when you kind of add that all up, you end up having made quite a few gains along the way. And simultaneously, they tend to not only operate in terms of sticks, in terms of sinking ships, for example, but also by putting out carrots, the ability to enter into negotiations with ASEAN as a group, as well as individual states, but at the same time, holding out bilateral relationships, economic relationships for the most part, with individual member states, both claimants and non-claimants to the South China Sea, and for the most part, this has worked. And what do I mean by that? It has tended to dilute perhaps the ASEAN's ability to operate as a cohesive whole. Now, the very recent statement issued at the end of June with Vietnam in the role of chair has been, I think, clearer and more robust than has previously been the case, but I think that's in relative terms. It is by no means a assertive or aggressive statement on the part of ASEAN, but I think if we see it in the context of previous statements, it does have a few more bits of direct language. So, for example, it refers to serious incidents in the South China Sea, which it hasn't not tended to in the past, and it very much expresses concern over militarization. Now, ASEAN tends to or prefers to work in a way that is very consensus-based. So the so-called ASEAN way, where consensus and relationships between the member states are seen as the bedrock or the foundation for ASEAN. But this has actually made it very difficult, and we'll talk about why in just a second, why it's been difficult for ASEAN to take a coherent and cohesive standpoint. The code of conduct that ASEAN is proposing and in negotiations with China, I think is a red herring. It's been extant now for over 25 years, and China uses it essentially as a faux focus that allows it to return to the table to talk, but at the same time to go out and do these salami tactics. And many observers have commented that China operates under a talk and take or a take and talk strategy, where it actually uses these talks as a way to de-escalate things, but at the same time doesn't hesitate to actually go out and achieve its objectives through these incremental kind of fait accompli on the ground or on the water, as it may be. It's not helped by the fact that within ASEAN, the 10 member states, have contested claims amongst themselves. There are four claimant states within ASEAN, and they have, to some extent, overlapping claims in some areas, but also contradictory basis for claims. And I think until ASEAN member states are able to reconcile those issues, it really does make it easier for China to divide and conquer. By taking ASEAN not as a coherent whole, but essentially disaggregating it and doing a hub and spoke form of diplomacy, where it essentially picks off individual members of ASEAN through bilateral relationships. So for example, in 2012, there was no ASEAN joint communique because Cambodia was in the rotating chair of ASEAN, and it was seen, even though it's a non-claimant in the South China Sea, it was seen to have been co-opted by China to really advance its agenda vis-a-vis the South China Sea during that meeting. In 2016, in April 2016, China declared that it had come to a 4-point consensus, along with Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos, that the South China Sea is not an issue between China and ASEAN as a whole, and rather it should be dealt with on a kind of plurilateral or series of bilateral relationships, which so far ASEAN has not really been able to overcome. Now, again, as I mentioned, this June, ASEAN has made a tough stance, relatively speaking, but at the same time, in the same communique, it also looked forward to the possibility of signing the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a large trade deal between ASEAN and non-ASEAN member states, including China. So it's very difficult on one hand to be tough on China vis-a-vis the political and economic issues in the South China Sea, while at the same time looking forward to some kind of more comprehensive and harmonious economic relationship on the other. And I think ultimately ASEAN's strategic priority, which is a reduction in the militarization of the South China Sea, may well be what really gets frustrated here. A day after the ASEAN communique was released in June, the United States sent 2 aircraft carrier strike groups to an exercise in the South China Sea, the second that it conducted in a quick succession in the Pacific, with a total of 3 carrier groups in the region. And this is really, if ASEAN is serious about non-militarization, it's not just Chinese non-militarization that is the objective. It also has to be no U.S. militarization either. Interestingly, again, going on to this kind of to and fro, take and talk relationship, immediately earlier this month in July, China has now agreed to more talks with ASEAN, going back to this negotiation stance to go look at the code of conduct. So we can see again this give and take, these kind of salami tactics where China will incrementally do a fait accompli on the ground to take more of the South China Sea, to establish more steps to kind of reify its control, including using violence against fishing ships, etc., but at the same time doesn't shy away from engaging either individually or collectively with the ASEAN member states. And I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Greg, who's going to talk more about this, including the very important ASEAN member that I have not mentioned, which is the Philippines. Thanks.
Thanks, Christopher. So I'm going to try to focus mostly on the U.S. interests here and how they've evolved. And what I think's important to keep in mind is that the disputes haven't been static. There have been a dispute in one form or another, disputes over territory in the South China Sea for over a century. The South China Sea dispute over waters and seabed and airspace as we know it today is barely 25 years old. U.S. interests over that time have been pretty consistent. The broad principles. We've had the same 3 base principles in the South China Sea for a century. How much relative weight is accorded to each one has shifted largely as the claims of all of the claimants, but especially China, has changed. And so in the 1990s, China's claim vastly expanded, which resulted in a change in the primacy the U.S. gave to its various interests. So what are those interests? Well, the U.S. has, for the entire century that there's been a dispute over the islands, it has said that it is committed to neutrality on the questions of territorial sovereignty while still wanting to defend its allies and partners. It has, second, remained consistently committed to freedom of the seas in whatever definition that was at the time. So since the conclusion of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in the 1980s, that has meant something different than it did in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But it's always been, we will not accept claims that infringe on freedom of the seas as defined at the time. And then the third, related to those two, has been U.S. access. The U.S. military is committed to freely accessing and using the South China Sea as permitted by international law, because it's an international waterway. So you had, we can talk in Q&A if anybody wants about the early days, but from the 1950s on, 1950s, 1970s, the South China Sea for the U.S. was mostly about that allies part of its interest. It was about defending its credibility to its allies while remaining neutral. Because remember, from the 1950s until the 1970s, all of the occupants of the Spratly Islands were U.S. treaty allies. It was the Philippines, the Republic of China, and South Vietnam. China, the PRC, very quietly occupied one half of the Paracels, but didn't really do anything with it. So it was all about keeping these parties from fighting because we had bigger concerns. In the 1970s, that rapidly shifted. So in 1974, the PRC invades the western half of the Paracels, drives the South Vietnamese off. The U.S. is very slow to respond, barely even aware of where the Paracels are by that point in time. In 75, Saigon falls. In 79, we break our relations with the ROC and formally recognize the PRC. And so by 79, suddenly there was only one U.S. treaty ally left in the South China Sea, the Philippines. And it's no longer just an academic question what that means, because you now have North Vietnamese troops from 75 on having occupied all of South Vietnam's outposts in the Spratlys. You have a very real concern in Manila that the North Vietnamese are going to continue to roll through and they're going to invade Philippine Islands next. And so this begins a very heated debate within the context of the U.S. Philippines alliance about what exactly that alliance means in the context of the South China Sea, because we have an Article 5 commitment to the Philippines, just like we do to Japan or Australia or to the NATO allies, but it covers territory. And it is vague about what it means in the context of disputed territory. Now, this debate happened over the course of about 4 years. We finally came to an internal consensus within the State Department that the U.S.-Philippine treaty committed us to defend Philippine armed forces, vessels, and aircraft in the waters, but not necessarily on disputed islands. Because the Philippines had only recently occupied those islands, it's hard to claim that it did so in self-defense. It could easily be argued that the Philippines picked a fight by moving into the Spratlys. The U.S. wasn't going to weigh in. This came back to our neutrality. But we were going to say that nobody's allowed to unilaterally use force to change the situation. And we weren't willing to be shown as letting an ally down, especially our last ally. And that's basically where things stood. From 1979 until really the 1990s, the South China Sea wasn't disputed. The Spratlys and Paracels were disputed. That dispute had basically crystallized. Everybody understood where the lines were. And as long as nobody used violence, we were good. In 1988, China invades starts to move into the Spratlys, has a fight with the Vietnamese at Johnson Reef. You have, I think, 60 Vietnamese dead. But it's still, Vietnam is being isolated at the time, both by China and the U.S. and all the rest of ASEAN. Nobody really comes to Hanoi's defense. It's not until 1995 when, as Anne-Marie referenced, China takes Mischief Reef, which is not only closer to the Philippines than any of its other outposts, it's also entirely underwater. And that's a big problem. At the same time, you have the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea coming into force in 1994, just a year earlier, and China ratifying in 96. The rules have been set. Everybody, including the US, which failed to ratify, but did sign and abides by UNCLOS, everybody had agreed on what the rules were. As Anne-Marie said, every state gets a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Every state gets a continental shelf below that. And that's it. Beyond that, it's international waters. The rules had shifted, but there was still an agreed upon set of rules, and China had helped negotiate those rules and ratified it. And yet, for some reason, China had just built a base on a piece of the seabed that all of the rules agreed belonged to the Philippines. At the same time, Chinese officials begin throwing around new words. Prior to this, Chinese officials had always, going all the way back to the 1952 debates around the San Francisco Treaty, had argued that it claimed the Xisha Islands, meaning the Paracels, the Nansha Islands, meaning the Spratlys, as well as Zhongsha Islands, which don't exist, and the Dongsha Islands, which are the Pratas. But suddenly it starts talking about historic rights. It doesn't just claim the islands and the territorial seas around the islands. It also claims vaguely defined historic rights throughout the entire South China Sea, as demarcated by the 9-dash line that Anne-Marie showed. Now, the 9-dash line also, frankly, didn't matter to anybody outside of a handful of Chinese cartographers until the 1990s. It existed as a way to show the islands that China claimed inside of it. Only in 1995, 1996 did it suddenly come to be a claim to waters and seabed. So for the first time in 95, not only do you have ASEAN and China starting negotiations on their first attempt at a code of conduct, because the Filipinos, of course, were scared by the occupation of Mischief Reef. Everybody was scared by what historic rights meant. You also have the U.S. step in, not just talking about its treaty commitments, as it had before, but talking about international law. So in 1995, the State Department issues a statement saying that it supports the ASEAN-China COC negotiations. It wants to see all disputes resolved peacefully and in accordance with international law, and it will not accept any resolution that infringes on the rights of third parties to freely navigate in the South China Sea. This is the first time the U.S. ever had to say it, because until 1995, the question of the South China Sea being international waters was not in dispute. None of the other claimants had ever argued that they got anything other than the islands. This starts a chain reaction. We have the DOC negotiated and signed in 2002. Things kind of bottom out for the 2000s, but China continues to very quietly push. In 2009, as Anne-Marie said, the 9-dash line gets submitted as an official demarcation of China's claim to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. At the same time, the scale of Chinese harassment, Coast Guard and Navy, of its neighbors begins to increase. So from 2009 on, we get trapped in this escalatory cycle that we're still in today, in which China is steadily seeking to push its neighbors out of their legal rights under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The neighbors are consistently calling for an internationalization of the dispute. Now, mostly that means the Vietnamese and the Filipinos, but from time to time you have the Indonesians as well wanting to internationalize this to a degree, recognizing that they need support against China. In 2010, at the behest of ASEAN members, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton declares at the ASEAN Regional Forum that freedom of navigation and peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with international law in the South China Sea is a U.S. national interest, reiterating that 1995 statement, but raising it to the level of the Secretary of State. We have the Philippines file their arbitration case. It gets resolved in 2016. China has lost. Again, everybody has agreed on what the rules are, and yet China continues to push. And at the same time, at the end of 2013, we have these Chinese dredgers. These dredging ships show up and start building artificial islands. Today, there are 3,200 acres of land in the Spratly Islands that didn't exist before 2013, including at Mischief Reef, which Anne-Marie showed, which was underwater 10 years ago and is now roughly the size of the I-495 beltway around Washington, D.C. The goal of China's island building is not primarily to fight and win a military contest with the U.S. It's to allow China to maintain the kind of persistent peacetime presence, Coast Guard, fishing, paramilitary, throughout the 9-dash line that creates de facto control, the de facto control that Christopher talked about. Today, if you are a Vietnamese fisherman or a Filipino fisherman or a Malaysian oil and gas ship and you sail out more than a few miles from shore, chances are you're going to bump into a Chinese law enforcement vessel or a Chinese paramilitary vessel. That was not the case 10 years ago. 10 years ago, China had very limited capacity to do anything south of the Paracel Islands. So as a result, Southeast Asians are being squeezed out of the South China Sea. And for the US, increasingly the concern is twofold. We still have this concern about allies, meaning the Philippines in particular. We must continue to maintain the credibility of the Article 5 commitment to the Philippines. Otherwise, it starts a snowball effect, right? If you fail one ally, even the least of your allies, everybody begins to question whether or not the Americans still have the spine to be a Pacific power. And, the Australians, the Japanese, the Koreans begin to wonder what the price is on their head. Two, the U.S. is unwilling to accept whatever historic rights means. And it's not clear what it means. All we know is that every other nation in the world has a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and China believes it has 1,000 miles of rights in the South China Sea. And you simply can't accept that. If you accept that, it begins the process of unraveling UNCLOS. Because why would any rational actor in the international system restrict themselves to a 200-mile EEZ if China gets 1,000? Why wouldn't there be a race to grab all of the Arctic? Why wouldn't the Americans claim everything out to 1,000 miles from our Pacific islands? It would be tying your hand behind your back to continue to maintain commitment to UNCLOS. And then the third, again, related to those, is increasingly this question of access. Because if China controls 1,000 miles of water in the South China Sea, and if the US is shown to be a paper tiger vis-a-vis our ally, the Philippines, and thereby lose whatever rotational access we might get in the South China Sea, it's going to be harder and harder for the US to credibly project power in these international waterways. And so over time, the net effect will be that the US will increasingly be pushed out of the South China Sea in any effective way. We'll still sail through, you'll do a FONOP, but there'll be no question about the US effectively contesting Chinese air and sea power in the South China Sea. So all three of those remain top US concerns. Clearly, the South China Sea is not lost yet, but it's being lost from the perspective of the United States and the broader international community. China's control is greater every single day. And I see three potential futures here. One, the one that Beijing is headed toward now, is the South China Sea becomes a Chinese lake. It de facto establishes an EEZ in the South China Sea, whatever phrases it wants to use, adjacent waters, relevant waters, historic rights, it all means the same thing. Nobody fishes or drills for oil and gas or does anything else unless they have China's permission. That begins the unraveling of UNCLOS. It undercuts a key component of all international law, which is that all states are equal, big or small. No, in Asia, states are not equal. China has one set of rules and everybody else just lives with it. It also undercuts the credibility of the US as a Pacific power because, again, it will let down the Philippines. It will show that supporting a US presence doesn't actually help our partners. We were unable to secure the legal rights of our smaller partners. All we're able to do is sail our own Navy ships through the South China Sea, and that doesn't help anybody. Option two is the US messes up in trying to respond to this, and we accidentally find ourselves in a clash with China that neither side actually wants. And if that happens, it doesn't really matter who wins. The juice will not be worth the squeeze. There is no rational actor who should think that it is worth a US-China conflict in the South China Sea. But it's also not worth simply letting China establish a de facto lake. And so option three, the only option that's really acceptable to anybody other than Beijing, is that the US helps lead, and it can only help, an international effort to convince Beijing to reassess its cost-benefit analysis. China will get more than it arguably deserves in the South China Sea. The question is, can you impose enough cost and offer enough inducements for Beijing to compromise in a way that its neighbors and the international community can live with? Right now, Beijing has no incentive to compromise. It's winning day by day, and it has the entire field to run. If you impose the kind of reputational and economic costs that, for instance, the international community did to Russia after the annexation of Crimea and the support of paramilitaries in the Donbass, that might begin to alter Beijing's analysis. Basically, if the international community draws a line and says China can either be a global leader or it can be a bully to its neighbors, but it can't be both, that would bring Beijing around to some form of compromise. But barring that, we're headed for option one or two. And I'll wrap up there.
Thank you both, Christopher and Greg, for those extremely interesting remarks. And Greg, you ended on an extremely optimistic note there. So actually, perhaps I can just use my prerogative as chair before I turn to the many questions that we have to try to tie both of your comments together with a question, which is, Greg, for your scenario of option three, the US has to work with local Southeast Asian partners, right, as well as global ones. And Christopher, you've indicated that ASEAN has been fairly weak in this regard, and yet what we've seen recently in the face of many of the Chinese provocations that you have discussed in 2020, we've seen Malaysia taking a bit of a stronger stance. We've seen, obviously, the Philippines issue the note verbal that you mentioned. Indonesia did one as well. It seems as if China's assertiveness in 2020, particularly in the wake of COVID, is generating a backlash against China. And so I guess the question that I'd like to pose to both of you is, A, do you agree with that assessment, Christopher? And if so, is it more than transitory? Is there an opportunity that you think some of these Southeast Asian states, the Philippines coming to Vietnam's support. We've never seen that before. And yes, it's only verbal, but it's still a measure. And to you, Greg, do you see the U.S. focusing on these kind of smaller moves and not just throwing in the aircraft carriers, but do you see the U.S. actively using their frustration with China's recent moves to kind of craft a broader strategy other than the phone apps that you mentioned that might actually be sustainable and get us to that happy option 3 rather than the pessimistic point that you landed on? So perhaps, Chris, you can speak first and then Greg, and then we'll turn to the audience Q&A.
Yeah, great questions, Emery. And I think there's a big distinction I would make anyway between ASEAN's response as an organization and the responses of individual member states. And I think so far, you're right, there have been some more robust responses on the part of individual claimant states. But what we haven't seen is ASEAN as a group really coming together and drawing a line. Now, I think what we wouldn't have even the marginally more robust communique from ASEAN had Vietnam not been in the chair, for example. We didn't see anything like this when Thailand was the chair or other non-claimant states. So I think in some senses, this has been a bit of a perfect moment in the sense that with Vietnam in the chair, they made South China Sea a priority and were able to the communique, for example, was a chair's draft. It was not a negotiated communique. So they were able to kind of insert that language. Now, clearly, the ASEAN way means there has to be some agreement and consensus to that. But as I said, if you take that as an isolated element, you have to compare it to the fact that they're also, ASEAN as a group is also looking forward to RCEP and other things. So I think there's some optimism there that ASEAN might be, towing a very, very rear guard line, which is to say, over this and no more, but doing so in a particularly soft way. And I think one of the other things that's useful in kind of taking a piece that you mentioned is, no matter how big we make the South China Sea, it still operates in an even bigger context, right? So, for example, we can't really take these isolated incidents in the South China Sea out of the bigger context of what China has done around the rest of its borders, vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis Hong Kong. To some extent, we can see this as a coordinated probing of what, even larger kind of campaign of salami tactics. So we shouldn't just necessarily see these within the context of South China Sea, but actually when you look about who else should be concerned, India should be concerned. For example, the Americans have asked FONOPs from Canadians, from Australians, from British naval ships. So to only focus this, as is often the case, as an ASEAN or Southeast Asia or Asian thing, I think in some cases very much loses those larger points that Gregory and I alluded to. So in that sense, ASEAN does have some opportunities to branch out and make this a more international issue. And I'm not sure ASEAN as a regional organization is really ready to do that in a coordinated fashion because of the divide and conquer elements that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, I think that the U.S. is, well, certain agencies are attempting to focus more attention on the South China Sea, largely because it's couched within their broader concerns about beating up on Beijing. This Department declaratory policy is getting better over the last 6 months. It doesn't make up for the fact that it's been basically silent on the South China Sea for the last 3 years. The White House is missing. I think the state will continue to get better over the next few months. But the bottom line is that this administration is probably incapable and uninterested in the kind of international coalition building it would take to really impose costs. Because no matter how good the U.S. messaging is, China can always say, well, this is just the American and its puppets, right? It's the Aussies and the Japanese and the Americans, and that's it. Nobody else cares. And if the U.S. butted out, Asia could solve Asian problems, despite the fact that the Vietnamese and the Filipinos desperately want international pressure. So what you really need is the Europeans more involved, and that's not likely to happen now. I am a little hopeful that one of the effects of COVID might well be a growing disillusionment with China on other topics might bring some of the Europeans back to the table. Now, keep in mind that in 2016, in the wake of the Philippine ruling, the entire European Union signed a statement saying that they would call on China to comply with that ruling. And then after the ruling came out, consensus broke, largely because of 2 members of the European Union. And since that day, the UK is the only one who's had the spine to stand up and say it. The French, the Germans, the Italians, not a single one has called on China to comply with the 2016 ruling. So it's not just the US that's at fault here. The whole international community has been engaged in a lot of fence sitting that's not helping anybody.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a question here, one from Amy Friedman, and her question is, so what will China offer in return for keeping Southeast Asian states from really getting up in arms over Chinese encroachment? BRI funding and projects, or obviously, Christopher, you mentioned a lot of carrots. You talked a little more, Greg, about the coercive side. Is it just BRI? What else might it offer, or how would you address that question, please?
I guess we'll both come in on that. It's a great question, and I think this is where China really does hold the upper hand vis-a-vis a lot of these smaller states in the region. So we look at countries like Cambodia, for example. It's not just BRI, formal infrastructure projects in places like Sihanoukville, for example, but also diplomatic top cover in terms of silencing critiques against Cambodian human rights abuses, also ramped up under the guise of COVID-19. We've seen this kind of protector role that China has been willing to play in various UN fora like the Security Council, and that's a fairly big card that they're able to play for places like Myanmar, for places like Cambodia, who aren't just looking for bilateral money, but that's also on the table. So countries like Laos, countries like Cambodia are effectively reliant on Chinese largesse, whether it's parts of the BRI initiatives or not. And that's a very powerful carrot that so far the United States has not been able to match, partly because they're hoisted on a particular petard about ignoring human rights abuses to the extent that you would be able to kind of match Chinese funding. And that is just a very difficult circle for the Europeans and for the Americans to square. The Japanese, with their quality infrastructure projects, have tried a little bit more to be a little bit less concerned about human rights issues, saying that's a local issue, it'll come in the fullness of time, we'll use development as a tool to increase human rights compliance, and we'll see if that is effective, but it's very difficult to play. Everyone else is playing second and third fiddle to the Chinese when it comes to those carrots within the region.
Greg, do you want to add anything?
I agree with all that. I just point out that China's the incentivization from China works best actually with the non-claimant states, right? It's not particularly effective with Vietnam. Vietnam mostly gets sticks when it doesn't want to listen. It's been tried and found wanting repeatedly in the Philippines. It works with Malaysia, but that's largely because Malaysia doesn't really put the South China Sea at the forefront of its policy in the way that the others do. But mostly what China's done is it's muzzled ASEAN by, breaking off the Cambodians in particular, but also Myanmar and Laos, where Chinese investment and loans are way higher than any rational actor could expect. It has done the same with the European consensus by basically making a quid pro quo out of a handful of BRI projects. In the 2016 lead up to the ruling, most of China's support came from the Arab League, and that's because China made an explicit quid pro quo in China Arab League statements to voice support for China's position. Nobody in the Arab League cared about the arbitration, right? They just signed it to get in exchange for Chinese largesse. So it's part of the goal here has to be bringing the South China Sea dispute out of the ASEAN context. It will never, ASEAN is not capable of managing the South China Sea dispute, and it shouldn't be asked to. But I do think that China's ability to continue to buy silence is limited, right? I mean, there comes a point at which you're going to have dead mariners in the water and nobody can pretend that reality is not reality.
Okay, thank you both for those answers. We have a couple of questions for Greg on the Philippines. So, oh boy, somebody just more questions popped up and I lost those. All right, so Greg, I'm going to read both of these and ask you to respond, please. The first is the statement of Secretary Pompeo saying that South China Sea is covered under the Mutual Defense Treaty between Manila and Washington. Does that change everything, or is it just a paper statement to appease Manila? And then also on the U.S. Philippine alliance, an anonymous attendee asks, with President Duterte rescinding the visiting forces abrogation, do you think it's time for Washington and Manila to go back to the negotiating table to strengthen the alliance in order to cover the South China Sea? So perhaps you could address those, please.
Yeah. So Secretary Pompeo's statement last March was a important clarification, but it wasn't exactly earth-shattering. I mean, I had talked about the 79 consensus. We also had Secretary of State Cyrus Vance at the time make clear that the South China Sea was covered by the Mutual Defense Treaty. Secretary Bill Cohen did the same in 1998 during a trip to Manila. What Pompeo basically did was repair the damage of the Obama administration, where Obama had very explicitly refused to clarify that the South China Sea was covered in the same way that the Senkakus were for Japan. And so this was a reiteration and a slight clarification of declaratory policy that goes back 40 plus years. The real key is, can we back it up? And that's what worries me. When we said that in 1979, it was in the context of renewing the U.S. Philippine basis agreement. When we said it in 1998, we had just inked the visiting forces agreement. We're saying it now when the VFA, as the other questioner pointed out, is on the ropes. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which would allow rotational access for U.S. forces, has not been implemented. There are no U.S. aircraft closer to the Philippines than Okinawa. That's 1,300 miles from the Spratly Islands. So if the Chinese made a small attack on, say, the Philippine Marines on the Sierra Madre, which is the ship they have grounded on Second Thomas Shoal, the Chinese base at Mischief Reef is 20 miles away. The U.S. is 1,300 miles away. You do the math. We cannot credibly defend the commitment that Pompeo made last March. And that needs to be reiterated to both officials in Washington and Manila. If they want that commitment, there has to be a quid pro quo. The U.S. has to be given access to the Philippines in some form or another. Rotational, not permanent, but if you want U.S. support, the U.S. has to be able to get planes overhead in less than 48 hours, which it can't right now.
Can I just come in on that, because I think it is a bigger issue about this idea that everybody would like to, in international relations, talk about alliance strategies and bandwagoning and balancing and hedging, and it assumes an awful lot of agency on the part of these small states. And really, if a state can't say no, do they really have any agency at all? So very, very poignantly, the Australians have been faced with this directly by the Chinese, who have said, you're not going to be able to have the best of both worlds, where you can have Chinese prosperity and American security. Now, and they basically said, choose one. And then we've seen some retaliatory escalation vis-a-vis China and Australia. If that's what they're able to do to Australia, a rich and well-connected country, imagine the kind of pressure and impossible choice that really represents to these small states, claim it or non-claim it. And as Greg said, if there isn't that ability to kind of back it up, you're expecting an awful lot, or we're expecting an awful lot out of these smaller countries within the orbit, however big or small we want to wrap that of China. So if we want to change that, where China can't necessarily put people on the kind of the horns of a dilemma and say choose one, we're going to have to do something about it to make that slightly less lopsided and asymmetrical.
Okay, thank you. There's two questions on kind of U.S.-China armed conflict that, Greg, perhaps I would address to you. In your talk, you mentioned that neither the U.S. nor China wants a conflict. Janet Gibson asks, we're seeing more significant force deployment and naval exercises in the South China Sea by both China and the U.S. How do you look at this development, and how could it trigger an open conflict at sea? how would it impact countries along the South China Sea, including Indonesia? And that is followed up by another question by Surya Klunkrit, who asks, will conflict between China and America lead to World War III?
So first, I would encourage everybody to look beyond the headlines of the week a little bit. I mean, U.S. posture, the number of U.S. Navy ships in the South China Sea really hasn't increased much. I mean, there's been a pretty steady but modest increase in the number of ship days that U.S. Navy ships spend in the South China Sea that goes back to the Obama administration. This dual carrier operation, yes, it was meant to send a message, and that's what it did, and then the carriers go home, right? There's not going to be two carriers sailing around the South China Sea consistently. Same goes for China. China has been increasing its operational tempo in the South China Sea as part of its larger buildup of the People's Liberation Army Navy, and that'll continue. At the end of the day, nobody is kind of surging forces to the South China Sea. When the U.S. Navy and the PLA Navy interact, it is largely professional, 99% of the time. I don't worry about the U.S. Navy and the PLA getting into a fight. It's a non-zero chance, but it's extraordinarily unlikely. The way a fight starts in the South China Sea is going to be with the China Coast Guard or the Chinese fishing militia. They're the ones who are actually the front line of China's coercion. The PLA Navy does very little. The PLA Navy follows the Coast Guard around as an implicit threat. It's the Coast Guard that's ramming, Malaysian boats or playing chicken with Vietnamese oil and gas operations. It's the fishing militia that represents the largest numbers and gets the most aggressive and are the most poorly trained. So if there's going to be a fight, it probably starts below what we would consider the level of military conflict, and it escalates. It involves, say, the sinking of a Philippine boat, a Philippine government ship responds, the Chinese Navy feels compelled to respond, then the U.S. is suddenly dragged in. So if we're looking at how you de-escalate the South China Sea, it doesn't matter how much we talk about professionalization and setting up hotlines and conflict mitigation measures with the navies, because the navies aren't going to be the ones who started. And then the big question, would it lead to World War III? Probably not. A conflict in the South China Sea would be short and sharp, and right now the U.S. would probably lose it because China controls most of the bottom of the escalation ladder. For the U.S. to fight into the South China Sea requires using a lot of very expensive, very escalatory long-range assets. China controls all of the stuff that's actually there now.
Okay. There's a question from James Stillman, who says that the U.S. Army Chief of Staff arrived in Thailand today. Does the visit have any wider bearing on the conflict in the South China Sea? Obviously, Thailand is not a claimant in this. Christopher, do you want to hop in on that?
No, it doesn't really. The American Army involvement in Thailand is very much about bolstering a series of capabilities, what we might call transnational counterterrorism, counter-drug operations that the Thai military provides essentially as an on-the-ground partner with the United States. It also strengthens that treaty obligation, which is a long-standing one over 150 years now. And the Cobra Gold series of exercises where American forces exercise with their Thai counterparts and often other bilateral involvement from other people within the region from other ASEAN states is a long-standing series of commitments. It has been used as a way of modulating U.S. commitment to Thailand. So immediately after the 2014 coup, for example, there were ways of kind of de-escalating the participation of that. So having the U.S. Army Chief of Staff there certainly sends a signal that American relationship with Thailand is back on a more normal footing after the 2019 somewhat civilian assumption of control. So in that, it's a signal, but I don't think it's anything to do with the South China Sea. It's just meant to indicate to everybody that there are treaty commitments within Asia, and America is going to put boots on the ground from time to time to kind of to bolster that. The issue with Thailand, like other countries, is that they are looking to some extent to hedge, and they would like to have it both ways. They have a strong commitment from the Americans militarily, but they also don't hesitate to buy Chinese naval and military goods, tanks and armored personnel carriers from Russia, for example. The Thai foreign policy of, bending in the wind like a bamboo shoot, as they would like to say, has been fairly effective to play both sides. And it'll be interesting to see for how much longer they're capable of doing that. But I wouldn't read any more into this visit than that kind of normal treaty relations.
Anne-Marie, if I can just jump in for 30 seconds.
Sure.
I think the thing that I always point out about Thailand is not going to be the ally you need in the South China Sea, right? Any conflict involving China, the Thais are not going to be your ally. The U.S.-Thai alliance is not underpinned by any legal documents. There are no treaties. It's 50 years of handshakes and winks. And it's 50 years of handshakes and winks that made a lot of sense during the Cold War when the Thais were a frontline state in containing communism. Increasingly, we don't have shared strategic interests. Thailand does not share the U.S. threat perception of China. Thailand does like the capacity building support and the prestige that the Army gets from the U.S., but they're not going to put any skin in the game in a U.S.-China conflict. You're more likely to look to the Singaporeans or even down the line maybe the Vietnamese than you are your so-called treaty ally in Thailand, if it comes to that.
I agree with you 100%. I'm actually writing a paper on that. I'd love to get your views on at some point. And I guess since we don't have that many questions, I'll just pop in on this. To your point about the Thai alliance and to your point about having to choose, right? I mean, Thailand wanted to get submarines and the Chinese induced them, with 3 submarines for the price they could get 1 South Korean, but it comes with the provision that they have access to Sadahit Naval Base, right? And that these are stationed there and that it's Chinese technicians who work and service on those subs. It's still going forward, but gee, if you have Chinese technicians at Sadahit Naval Base, then the US is not going to dock its key naval forces there. And that is one of these very small ways in which China is using carrots outside of BRI and all of this in order to change facts on the ground and kind of dislodge the US from the region. So I agree with you 100%. There are 2 questions, and Greg, I think I'll put these primarily to you, although Christopher, if you want to hop in, about the role of the fishing, Chinese fishing fleets and Coast Guard. So there's one question: what role going forward might the Chinese Coast Guard paramilitary play in the dispute as distinct from PLA forces? I mean, Greg, you touched on that. But then there's a second question from Thomas Havlack, who asks, how much control does the Chinese central government versus provincial governments and even local governments have over their fishing fleets? And so perhaps you could comment on that.
Sure. So like I said, the Coast Guard and the militia are really the front line because China doesn't want military conflict. It wants to convince the region that the fight's not even worth having, that by sheer force of numbers, China has already won. And so when you look at the operations this year, for instance, the oil and gas survey off Malaysia that Christopher talked about, it's not the Navy the Navy's there, but they're hanging back. The survey ship is surrounded by non-uniformed, fishing boats that are actually recently retired PLA officers who have changed one uniform for another. They go out there and they play chicken with Malaysian government vessels. They do the same with the Filipinos around Pitu Island, the largest Philippine-held island. They did the same last fall for the Vietnamese. It's about changing the risk calculation for these states. All China needs to do is use its Coast Guard and militia, which are far larger and better armed than half of the Navy boats that the region can field, to make it too dangerous. And already today, I would argue that offshore oil and gas production in the South China Sea is basically a fairy tale for any of the Southeast Asians. Malaysia will keep pushing with Petronas. For the Vietnamese, I think they've already crossed the line. They just haven't realized it. And the Filipinos are never going to access Reed Bank because no commercial actor can possibly think it's a smart idea to invest in this. The risks are too high. China has done that without firing a shot, simply by playing chicken with these guys. And so if you want to counter that, there's no military solutions. What are you going to do? Have the U.S. Navy go out and protect every fishing boat in the South China Sea, or start firing on unarmed Chinese fishermen, hoping that they happen to be part of the militia? The only way to do it is with the political, diplomatic, economic pressure that you would bring to bear on any other illegal paramilitary actors in the world. The same thing you do to the Russians or the North Koreans or the Iranians. You don't treat them the way you do a foreign navy, because they're not. And then as far as control, this is an interesting question. I do think that we overestimate sometimes how much decisions are being made by Chinese leadership in Zhongnanhai, because an incident will happen. A fishing boat shows up off Indonesia and sparks a protest, and somebody calls me and says, "Hey, why did Beijing decide to do this now?" Beijing didn't decide to do this now. Beijing has implemented a policy ecosystem that says go forth and assert rights. Everybody, every actor, from state-owned oil companies to the lowliest fishermen, is encouraged. They are incentivized economically or politically to go out and assert rights. And some small percentage of those operations go wrong. And when they go really wrong, that's when somebody in Beijing has to step in and de-escalate, as we saw in January with Indonesia, where Xi had to get on the phone with Jokowi. Most of the time, though, it's handled by local Coast Guard or the South Sea Fleet or provincial officials in Hainan. And Xi Jinping is only vaguely aware.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a kind of follow-up to your scenario 3, Greg. We have a question from Joanna Gwodowski, who asks, what specific incentives or pressure can the U.S., its allies, and obviously the EU and others use to modify Chinese behavior? What would be most effective? So you've talked a lot about changing risk calculations, cost benefits, etc. Would you be able to give us a few more specifics on that?
Yeah, and I think it has to be done iteratively, right? Because what you want to do, what you constantly want to do is build up pressure while leaving off ramps. You want to consistently leave the door open for China to seize the opportunity for compromise and get whatever the cost imposition is decreased. It starts with just talking about it. I mean, 2015, 2016, this was the top agenda item, not just in ASEAN meetings, the G7 meeting, at discussions in the UN General Assembly. This was the topic, the EU. Today, you're going to find it at point 10 or 11, buried underneath a bunch of trade fights and North Korea disputes. Even in the ASEAN meetings, it's not the top issue when the outside parties are there. So getting it escalated to the top of the international agenda builds its own kind of pressure. It starts undercutting China's narrative that it's a responsible global leader. And then I would look at specific economic levers. So for instance, you don't issue broad-based sanctions against China. Start identifying fishing associations who are engaged in militia work. They're violating not just the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, they're violating the regulations to avoid collisions at sea, they're violating any number of cues. Start targeting them for sanctions, ban them from access to international financial markets, treat them the same way you did Russian actors in the Donbass, who did the exact same thing, they just weren't on boats. Have the Seventh Fleet get overhead and start taking pictures of Chinese militia activity and releasing it to the UN in the same way we do violations of North Korean sanctions in the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea. Find creative ways to impose cost on individual Chinese actors while still giving Beijing the political cover to disavow them and change tack if it wants to. Just like it has with, violations of North Korean sanctions, where every time you catch a boat smuggling coal, the Chinese government pretends that it had no idea what's happening.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a question here from Henning Hegland, who asks, is there a role for the Quad, i.e. the India, Japan, US, and Australia, I'm not going to call it an alliance, agreement to further Indo-Pacific cooperation to counter Chinese expansion? Do either of you want to address that question?
Sure. I mean, I think as you rightly point out, the Quad is several layers below what we might call an alliance, right? It's an arrangement. It's enjoyed a little bit of a resurgence in interest lately, largely on the part of the Indians, partly because they are feeling pressure from the Chinese, but certainly it is a large part of the Japanese attempt to talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific as a coordinated and connected region, which is, I think, is a good and useful thing, rather than taking this as a microcosm to connect it to a much wider region, which has more interests than just claimant states in a particular sovereignty dispute in South China Sea. So it's a good mechanism to raise dialogue, to talk about these issues, as Greg says, to constantly keep it on the agenda. Japan, India, the United States, and Australia all have vital interests that go much more widely than just talking about sovereignty claims. So I think it's a good, I'm going to call it an arena or a forum for those kinds of discussions. I don't think people should expect that you would see a quad flotilla arriving in the South China Sea with, you know, multi-flagged ships coming in to do something or to challenge anybody. Individual member states that are part of the Quad have talked about freedom of navigation as an important aspect. So you may see individual ships doing that, but I don't think we should hold out for, you know, the Quad to the rescue, which I think in some senses has been one of the problems with this issue from the member state of ASEAN, is that they're looking for somebody to come and solve the problem, which I think, as Greg has said, is not going to happen. It's going to take actual engagement. It's going to take constant pressure, creative, you know, ways to keep this as an issue to be forefront. It's not going to be resolved by, you know, as you said, having the, you know, fawn ops or having aircraft carrier exercises in the South Pacific or the South China Sea. It's not going to be solved by anybody kind of coming over the horizon to the rescue. It's going to be a long and has to be consistent and protracted set of negotiations, which the Quad can form a part of.
Greg, do you want to hop in on that, or?
I will just flag one interesting observation, which is that the place where you see the most support for the Quad in the South China Sea seems to be Vietnam. And that's because Vietnam is the one with the unique relationship with India. But from the outside, realistically, Christopher's right. India is kind of the weak straw here when it comes to the military side. It sees the South China Sea as a secondary theater, and so the Quad, in effect, is a useful diplomatic arena, but the military side of it's a trilateral U.S. Australia Japan relationship, and India is not eager to join that.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, actually kind of two, involving Taiwan. Gregory Mitrovic asks, are there any implications of the South China Sea conflict for Taiwan? One of the things that we've seen recently in the wake of China passing or imposing the security bill on Hong Kong is that we've seen some real China hawks in Beijing saying that this is a prep for a takeover of Taiwan. Now, is that just talk? Is this true? If China is really going to make the move on Taiwan, does that mean that it would be any less likely to push its claims in the South China Sea because its interests will be diverted? Alternatively, there was a question about whether or not Taiwan had a role to play in the South China Sea conflict itself. So two kind of different issues about Taiwan. I don't know which one of you might want to address those.
I'll say something very briefly, which is to say Taiwan, again, it operates at two different levels. It is a claimant state within the South China Sea dispute itself, but also has bigger issues that this can be seen as the tip of the iceberg, to kind of take a metaphor out of context for the South China Sea, which is to say, is somebody going to stop this incremental kind of Chinese territorial aggrandizement, which clearly is the biggest issue in terms of Taiwan. Their claims in the South China Sea, whether they get a particular piece of the pie or not, I would think would be secondary to the larger issue, and that for them is not going to be solved or not in the South China Sea. When and if Beijing, manifests its long-standing claims on Taiwan, it will be done completely separately from what's going on in the South China Sea. But Taiwan would like to be able to see, for example, what that kind of international response to probing kind of, sovereignty claims anywhere, and use those as kind of a bellwether for how it might be able to get international support.
Okay, thank you, Christopher. Greg?
The South China Sea, you hear a lot of chatter about Taiwan playing a bigger role, but as Christopher said, the South China Sea is peripheral for Taiwan. It gets used for domestic political purposes, but at the end of the day, Taiwan always has bigger concerns. Unlike all the other claimants, Taiwan faces a constant threat of amphibious invasion from China. And so its willingness, its ability to leverage irritating Beijing on the South China Sea is relatively limited. It's also, people will say things like, well, the ROC is the one who invented the claim. The U-shaped line is a claim that originated from Chiang Kai-shek's government, not the PRC. Couldn't Taiwan just open up the archives and prove that the claim was never a claim to waters and airspace? It was just claimed to islands. Sure, it could do that, but what does it gain? If Taiwan does that, it's not suddenly going to be given back its seat at the United Nations. ASEAN's not going to invite it into the Code of Conduct negotiations. It's going to irritate Beijing, increase its pressure from China, and gain almost nothing from anybody else. So really, other than use in domestic political purposes, as the Ma government did when it it opposed 2016 award, Taiwan's hands are really tied on the South China Sea.
Okay, perhaps this has been asked and answered, but I'll pose it to you again, Greg, which is there's a question regarding what is the EU position. So you mentioned the European Union position coming out strongly in favor of the 2016 UNCLOS ruling, in favor of the Philippines. And you had mentioned, Chris, that sometimes European countries with their commitment to democracy and human rights, their order of interest with regard to the Southeast Asian countries can get diverted away from issues like the South China Sea. So I guess broadly, what would either of you like to say on the EU position? Because we have seen, right, in the last year, we've seen Great Britain do a phone-up. We saw France do a phone-up in the South China Sea. Is that a one-off for domestic political purposes? Is it a change in strategy? Any comments on the EU, please?
There is no longer an EU position on the South China Sea. There was an EU position on the South China Sea in spring of 2016, at which point all of the members and all of the associated states agreed. The 2016 arbitral award, when it came out, would be binding. We'd call on China to comply. That broke in August of that year. In August 2016, the Greek prime minister goes to Beijing, signs his country's BRI deal, including for the Piraeus port, and suddenly at the EU meeting in August, when it was tabled that we should reiterate our claim from March that we'll call on China to comply, the Greeks, along with the Hungarians and Croatians, but for more parochial interests, broke the consensus. And so since that day, the EU has not said a word effectively about the South China Sea. And what also happened is that then sidelined the bigger members, because at the G7 state summit in 2016, the 4 European members of the G7 had also said that they were going to call for China to comply. But the French, the Germans, and the Italians have refused to do that since, because they feel like they can't operate independent of the EU. So as a result, when it comes to declaratory policy, only the UK, given Brexit, feels that it is free to call for compliance with the 2016 arbitral award. The French are concerned about this in theory, and they have pledged to increase their presence, although they really haven't. I mean, the British did their own phone-up with the Albion. The French, it's been more of a promise to do that, and they did one sail through German shipwriter, but it wasn't really a phone-up. But anyway, that's all very nice, but in the same way that U.S. phone-ups don't really change anything, British and French phone-ups don't really change anything. What's needed is consistent declaratory policy, and only London has that.
Okay.
And
So
I would say,
I was just going to say, I guess we see that China has been very effective in incentivizing Greece and other members of the EU with BRI projects, so we see the same tools being used in that area as well as in Southeast Asia. Sorry, Chris, over to
Yeah,
you.
I was going to say, but to be, I don't know what the word is, you know, to be equitable, the Americans do the same thing in a slightly less sinister way, and that I think explains for Britain to do a FONOP in the South China Sea is much more about its relationship with Washington than it is with its relationship with Beijing. It's not doing it to annoy or upset the status quo in the South China Sea. It's doing it to show that it is a loyal and trusted international ally with Washington. It's doing it in the same reason why the Australians have done it, and the same reason why the Canadians have done it, because it was asked to by the Americans to kind of to provide a multinational sheen on this. So both large powers are essentially, you know, trying to rally, you know, more broad support, that kind of broad declaratory and consistent operations. So this doesn't look like a Beijing versus Washington kind of dispute.
Okay. Well, thank you both for that. We are just about out of time. So before I make a few concluding remarks, Greg and Christopher, do either of you have any closing remarks that you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Nothing for me. I can't imagine how much more depressing I could get.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I think you know, I think I will say this: the work that Greg and AMTI and has been doing is doing exactly what it says on the tin. The amount of transparency that the world has about South China Sea is only really possible from a civilian and a researcher perspective because of the work that's going on at AMTI. So I would put in a plug that if people in the audience are interested, it is your one-stop shop to get, you know, literally the bird's eye view. So when we talk about constructing things on atolls, well, what does that actually look like? The one photo that Anne-Marie showed is only one of several that you can get. And that website has enormous resources. If people are interested, please, you know, that's where you should go as your first protocol.
Thank you very much, Chris.
And I certainly couldn't agree with that more. And that is the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS.org in Washington. So I think to everybody in the audience, I hope you'll agree that we have had a very fascinating, if pessimistic, discussion. We've really got to the crux of the issue, both from the Southeast Asian perspective as well as from the China-U.S. perspective. I really want to thank Greg Poling from CSIS, Christopher Ankersen from NYU. Again, if you want to learn more about the New York Southeast Asian Network, you can check us out online. And before I turn it back to Courtney Doggart, I really want to thank the people behind the scenes who keep all of this going, and that would be Brian Tang at Network 2020 and Srinath Poole at the New York Southeast Asian Network. Thank you for making this work so smoothly. Courtney, over to you.
All right, just wanted to echo your thanks. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Greg, and Anne-Marie. Thank you for doing such a terrific job leading the discussion today. I hope that we might be able to send out some of those resources by email that were mentioned, as well as a link to the New York Southeast Asian Network. Just as a quick reminder to those who want a little bit more background, we do have a few videos on our YouTube channel from past discussions about China specifically, so please do check that out, and I believe that this will be posted to Network 2020's YouTube channel in full if you weren't able to catch everything. And we will be having more briefings coming up, hot off the press and not yet on our website, is next Thursday at 12 noon. We will be having a discussion on the future of the New START Treaty and whether or not we're headed for a new arms race, and that will be with retired Brigadier General Peter Zwak and Sharon Squassoni, who's affiliated with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, among others. So that should be a great discussion. Please keep checking our website for new briefings. And again, you know, I want to thank both of our panelists and Anne-Marie for just the depth of knowledge that you brought to this discussion today. It was really eye-opening, and we were really all fortunate to be able to hear from you. And thanks to everyone who joined from near and very far. So it was a wonderful discussion, and we couldn't have done it without all the participation from everyone online as well. So have a wonderful day, night, wherever you are, and we look forward to seeing you at future briefings.